We're going to talk about using your resources wisely, or using your talents wisely, or using your resources and your talents fully. So, a big part of the parasha this week, and it is the longest parasha of the year. So, what makes it so long?
Sorry, this parasha is the longest.
Nasoi is the longest parasha of the longest single parasha of the year. Part of what makes it so long is that it's got the record of the leaders of each of the 12 tribes bringing a sacrifice on behalf of their tribe in order to inaugurate the Mizbeach, the altar, which essentially inaugurates the Mishkan. And I'm sure you've heard this a million times, not really what we're going to speak about today, but the Torah repeats word for word the exact same details of that sacrifice 12 times over, instead of just saying, and he brought what the other brought. And one of the reasons we're told it is because you could have different people doing the identical mitzvah and they do it in their own way because we're all individuals. But that's not what we're going to focus on. Instead, what we're going to focus on is that the Torah tells us about what's called the Nesiim, who are the individuals bringing these sacrifices on behalf of their tribes. But the Torah also tells us that the Nesiim at this point, just before the inauguration of the Mishkan, they donate wagons. Okay? It's part of the story. They donate wagons. Now, it does sound a little bit strange because if you put it into context, you've got the build-up to this point, which is building the Mishkan. And in order to build the Mishkan, everybody had to contribute, and they had to contribute materials, starting from the very precious materials like gold, silver, and precious jewels, all the way to things that were a little bit more simple, like copper or wool, and so on. So everybody contributes in order to build the Mishkan. We've learned about this already weeks and weeks ago in Parashas Truma, which was all about building the Mishkan. And here you've got what sounds like, we're at the point that the Mishkan has already been built, and now we're starting service, and we're inaugurating the service of the Mizbeach, and that's why they're bringing these sacrifices on behalf of the 12 tribes. It no longer sounds like we're at the point of contribution. And yet, you get the story about how they contributed these 12, well, we're going to get to it in a second, these wagons to the base, to the Mishkan. And the interesting thing is that the language that the Torah uses is going to also raise our curiosity. Why does the Torah use this particular language? But before we get there, we've got to understand the dynamic of what was going on between the Nesiim, who are the leaders of the tribes, and everybody else when it comes time to build a Mishkan. So let's go back a step. When everybody contributed to build the Mishkan, what do you think that the atmosphere was? What do you think that the attitude was of the people who came to bring? Imagine you were there. And they made an announcement, listen, we're doing a fundraiser. We want to build this Mishkan. It's going to be Hashem's home. It's going to be a place that we can engage and interact and experience the divine presence and bringing sacrifices, etc., etc. And you were invited to participate. How would you feel?
Delighted.
Of course. You'd be excited. You'd be enthusiastic. And that's actually what happens. Not only are the people enthusiastic to participate, but the Torah tells us that they came with such energy and enthusiasm that it's the only time, honestly, it's the only time in the whole of Jewish history that they ran a Jewish fundraiser where the organizers at some point had to say, enough, we don't need any more. Halavai, right? Every organization wishes that they had this problem, that there was such enthusiasm, so much material that came forward. The Torah tells us, that the contribution that they had was sufficient, and it was more than sufficient. And after that, the Torah tells us that they made an announcement that people should not bring anything more. That was the surge of participation. We then see Rashi tells us, based on the sages in the Midrash, that the Nesiim, the leaders of the community, were a little bit left out of that process. And they wanted to play catch-up afterwards, because the Nesiim had taken a view, which you could debate outside of the context of what we're going to speak about today. We could debate their view, whether it was appropriate or not. Basically, they took a view, they'll stand back. They'll allow the community to come forward and to contribute, and their perspective was, anything that is shortfall, they'll fill in all of the shortfall. So it actually sounds like quite a noble approach, Basically saying we're ready to take whatever cost there is at the end of this process, we'll fill in the gaps. What they hadn't banked on is that there'd be no shortfall. Not only would there be no shortfall, but there'd be a glut, there'd be an excess. So when everybody stepped up and contributed to the Mishkan, now the Nesim had egg on their faces. What are we going to do now? Now we're not even participating in the Mishkan. So therefore you see in various ways that they stepped forward with a lot of energy as soon as there were other opportunities to participate in the Mishkan, because they didn't want to either be considered people who were disinterested or lose the opportunity to participate. So as soon as there were other opportunities, they came running. For example, the Torah tells us that the Nesim brought the special stones that had to be used in the choshen, in the breastplate, and the two shoulder things that the Kohen Gadol had. Now there's a debate whether the Nesim in that verse actually refers to the people, or if it refers to some kind of supernatural system that Hashem used in order to bring them these stones. But going with our argument, which is that the Nesim were left out and they were a little bit shemzech because they thought that they were going to fill in the shortfall. It never happened. So now they come running forward with a very unique contribution that you can't just get out of anywhere. These were very specific stones and they were very expensive, so they came running up. Likewise, when it comes time to bring the offerings in the Mishkan, they're first in line. We want to bring the first offerings because we saw what happened last time, that in the construction, or at least the contribution to construct the Mishkan, we were kind of left out. So now there's an opportunity to inaugurate the Mishkan. We're there. We're the first in line. We want to participate. In other words, you can understand the psychology of the Nesim at this point in time. They are feeling a very desperate need to compensate for the fact that they were not as good as they should have been. Now, if you plug that psychology into what happens next, it doesn't make any sense. Part of what they want to do in order to contribute, in order to show their enthusiasm, in order to be part of the Mishkan, is they want to give wagons to the Mishkan. Now, why do you need wagons in a Mishkan? You've got to transport. Because the Mishkan had to move with the Jewish people, and we know that they traveled to 42 different locations over the course of the 42 years in the desert. So there's got to be a transportation method, and they saw that there was an opportunity for this. That's it. They're going to contribute the wagons. Now there are 12 tribes, which means that there are 12 leaders, 12 Nesim, which means that you would expect a minimum of how many wagons? 12. That's what you'd expect, logically. Says the parasha this week, that here the Nesim are, with their great urgency to try and be relevant in the story of the Mishkan, bringing wagons in order to transport the Mishkan. What does the Torah tell us? They donated 6 wagons, and the Torah is specific. 1 wagon for every 2 Nesim. It tells us, just in case you didn't do the maths, tells us that 1 wagon for every 2 Nesim, plus a grand total of 12 oxen. So there would be 2 oxen per wagon in order to pull the wagons. Where's the magnanimity? Where's what's going on over here?
Got left out.
These are the guys who feel left out, that they were not there to participate, to be part of the whole drive in order to build the Mishkan. Now they want to compensate. You'd expect them to be extravagant. You'd expect them to make the fanciest, biggest, most wagons that you could possibly have. What did they come up with? 6 wagons.
Sorry, Rabbi. The 12 Nesim, were they couldn't have been, or they were descendants of the 12 sons, which made us the 12 tribes.
Well, each one of them is representative of a particular tribe. So they would have to, track back to the 12 sons, to the 12 original tribes.
It couldn't have been the original 12 sons.
No, it was not the original 12. No, this is generations later,
Yeah.
but they are descendants of and representatives of the 12 sons, and therefore the 12 tribes.
Are their names mentioned?
The names are mentioned. So the question is, what's going on over here? You couldn't keep it even more minimalistic. I mean, 6. That's it.
Maybe that's all.
6 wagons. What's
Maybe
that?
That's all they needed.
Okay. So now let's work that out. Maybe that's all they needed. So let's work it out. The Gemara goes into an analysis of how big each wagon was, comes to the conclusion that the wagons were 5 amos long and 2.5 amos wide. So working on an average, because there are different opinions about exactly how big an amma is, but typically what we say is every amma is approximately half a meter. So you're now talking about wagons that are 2.5 meters long, and basically whatever it is, 1.25 meters wide. They're not particularly large. Now try work out what's going on those wagons, because they're going to transport the Mishkan now, right? So what's going on those wagons? I can answer your question, were they sufficient? So what's going on those wagons? The Mishkan is made out of, the main structure of the Mishkan is made out of boards called Kurashim, which were made out of solid wood. They're not lightweight. Solid wood boards of the Mishkan. And the boards would have fitted snugly onto a wagon. But once you work out that there are only 6 wagons, you suddenly realize you're going to be piling these boards quite high. Plus, every board had to sit in silver bases. The silver bases, the Torah tells us the weight of those bases. They were not lightweight, because they had to secure the boards that they wouldn't fall over, because the boards were quite tall, right? So they had to secure the boards in these bases, silver bases. So those were pretty heavy in their own right. In addition to which, you have various columns that were used, also solid wood, that were used in the Mishkan, both in terms of the actual internal structure and in terms of the external structure. The external structure was columns with drapings of curtain, basically, between the various columns. So those had to be carried. Those columns the external ones, sat in brass bases, which is also quite heavy. No, this is not to mention all the other components that had to be carried as well, all the coverings, and there were hooks that had to be used. There were these bolts that were used to hold everything together. Basically, when you calculate what had to be carried, it's very it's hectic to carry it on only 6 wagons. In fact, we're actually told, Midrash tells us, that when they would travel, and Rashi goes into the Gemara tells us, Rashi goes into a lot of detail about what the Gemara says, they actually had to have Leviim walk alongside the wagons, because they were piled so high, those boards were piled so high, the Leviim had to constantly walk wherever they traveled alongside the wagons. So as soon as the board started to slide, the job of the Leviim was to push them back into place so they wouldn't fall off. Now, if you had a few more wagons, you wouldn't have this problem. If you had 12 wagons, let's just say that each of the Nesiim brought a single wagon instead of half a wagon, then you would have been able to distribute everything a little bit more evenly. You wouldn't have this problem of everything being so, tenuous and teetering as they were traveling through the desert. So, on the face of it, it does not appear as if what they gave was sufficient. Which takes us back to our original question. The psychology doesn't match up. Here you've got a group of people who are feeling so desperate to be relevant and to have an opportunity to participate and to compensate for the fact that they were not as dedicated as they could have been right at the beginning. So this is now their time to shine. What did they come up with? 6 relatively small wagons. And why only 2 oxen per wagon? When the 1820 settlers, the foot trekkers, exactly, when they came, they had more than 2 oxen per wagon, because let's be honest, it's a schlep.
And those wagons were bigger than 2 meters.
Exactly, but they weren't necessarily carrying the same kind of weight that the Mishkan was carrying. And also, just from a dignity perspective, this is the Mishkan you're talking about. You would expect it would have a little bit more dignity, have a whole span of oxen schlepping each wagon. 2 oxen pulling this whole piled up wagon. It doesn't sound right. And let's bear in mind, they were traveling through a desert. It's not like they were traveling on paved roads. Probably needed a little bit more ox power to get the thing moving. Okay, we know that the clouds smoothed out the path for them and it wasn't exactly like going through the desert normally. But still, you'd expect that you'd make it a little bit more elaborate. I mean, after all, this is God's temple that you're transporting. Everything's so minimalistic. I'll take it a step further. There's a very interesting Gemara in Tamid. Tamid is the Gemara that talks about the daily service in the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara there comments on a statement in the Mishnah that says before they would shecht the Tamid offering was brought every morning and every afternoon as a communal offering on behalf of everybody. The morning Tamid was to launch the daily sacrifices. The afternoon Tamid was to conclude the daily sacrifices. So they brought this sheep as this Tamid offering. And the halacha is that before you shechted an animal, you always had to give it something to drink. So the Mishnah says when they gave the Tamid offering something to drink, they gave it out of a golden cup. So the Gemara asks, why are you giving the sheep a drink out of a golden cup? Number one, it's a sheep. Number two, you're about to shecht it. What do you have to give it a drink out of a golden cup? So there are two opinions. The one opinion is that there was an exaggeration, wasn't necessarily gold. The Gemara does not accept that argument. The Gemara says that the reason is because ein anius b'mokim ashirus. If you are in a place of wealth, don't be cheap. This is not just a matter of a place of wealth. This is a matter of the dignity of Hashem. So the attitude is when you're in Hashem's environment, everything should be done not wastefully, but with as much pomp and ceremony as would be appropriate for the divine. So even the sheep that's about to be used as a sacrifice drinks out of a golden goblet. So if you apply that principle over here, ein anius v'mokim ashirus, that you should not be cheap in an environment of wealth and an environment of the divine, why are you making such a cheap version of the wagons? That's what you're transporting. These small little wagons. And that's all you could come up with in a seam. Only 6 wagons. Doesn't seem right. Make it beautiful. Make it extravagant. Can you imagine the Jews traveling through the desert with a whole, like each tribe has a wagon with Mishkan components? It would be a lot more elaborate. Now, there is a comment that may resolve it, and the comment based on the wording of the Pasuk, essentially our sages learned from the wording in the Pasuk that whatever they brought forward to Moshe, Moshe was able to tell them that Hashem endorsed what they had brought. And this applies across the Mishkan. Everything that was brought was endorsed by Hashem, which implies that somehow it was endorsed by Hashem that there should only be 6 wagons. But that doesn't answer the question. Why would Hashem want only 6 wagons? If it could be done in a much more beautiful way, in a much more efficient way. I haven't answered the question. You've just said, okay, so they somehow have a justification because they've somehow got the divine approval for it. Now, the simplest answer that people would offer is maybe they didn't have enough materials. That's the easiest answer. Why? Because you might remember that the Rashi also brings us as well, that the question is, how did the Jews have wood to build the Mishkan? They're in a desert. Where do you find wood in a desert in order to build the Mishkan? Does anybody remember how they had wood? Because Yaakov had the foresight to know that one day they'd bring a Mishkan. So hundreds of years earlier, when Yaakov came down to Egypt, he brought saplings from Israel of acacia trees, planted those saplings in Egypt. They then, obviously, the Jewish people obviously had to look after those trees and nurture those trees so that they grew. Then when it was time for them to leave, they realized there has to be a purpose for these trees. They cut them down, they took the wood with them. That's how they had the wood in order to build the Mishkan. So logically, maybe there wasn't enough wood after building the Mishkan to be able to make more wagons. Maybe that's the reason. The only problem with that argument is that the Torah tells us what wood they had to use for the Mishkan. The Torah does not mandate what kind of wood they had to use for the wagons. So, sure enough, they must have had a limited amount of acacia wood because that was part of this plan already from Yaakov about how much wood they were going to use for the Mishkan. That's all fine and good. But for these wagons, they could have gotten any wood. And the Midrash tells us that throughout their 40 years in the desert, the Jewish people traded with other merchants who traveled through the desert. And they easily could have sourced other wood in order to build their wagons. So you can't tell me that the reason for the limited amount of wagons is because of a limited amount of resources, because there was a way that they could have gotten wood. So what we are left with is our original question. If this is a moment for the Nesiim to compensate for having been slack in their donations to the Mishkan, and this is where they could show that they are really invested and they really care and they want to make the Mishkan a beautiful experience, why do they contribute such a limited contribution of just 6 wagons that's going to cause 40 years of stress for the Levim who have to accompany them, and they really could have made it a much more beautiful, elaborate contribution? The answer to that question will address our question in our own lives about how much should we be doing and how much should we be giving to Hashem's, so to speak, projects.